July 1996. A trawler hauls its net off the Devon coast, and inside the fish there's a body. No wallet, no papers, every label cut out of his clothes. A belt of lead diving weights round his waist. One thing was still on him, a Rolex. That watch would end up naming the dead man, and then his killer. The boat was the Malcarry, working Lyme Bay, 6 miles out, on a morning like 1,000 others. The skipper felt the net go heavy. He figured he'd snagged a bag of rubbish or a bit of wreck. You know the half-second when you reach into a coat you haven't worn since winter, and your fingers find something unidentified. That's the half-second he had, looking down into the net at a shape that was wearing a shirt. They didn't cut him loose. They radioed it in, and they brought him home. That decision matters later. The man had been in the water weeks. The sea had taken his face, his fingerprints, most of what identifies you. The post-mortem gave the basics. Middle-aged. Around 5'10". Nothing that narrows down a country of 60 million. No recorded scars. No surgical plates. No dental work matching any file that anyone was currently looking for. But there was one thing on the body the killer had put there deliberately, and it changed the case. The lead. A diving belt, loaded with weights, buckled round his waist. Divers don't drown wearing their weights by accident. You ditch that belt first. It's the one thing you're trained to drop. He never got the chance. So this wasn't a swimmer, or a fall from a ferry. Somebody had wanted him on the seabed. And whoever it was had been careful. Pockets emptied, labels gone. The kind of tidying you do slowly, on purpose. The police did the obvious thing first. They pulled every missing person report that even loosely fit him. Nothing. Nobody had reported him gone, which tells you something quietly awful about how he'd been living. A man can vanish for weeks and leave no ripple, if the people who'd notice have already been managed. Weeks passed. The file had a case number, a body, and no name to put on either. Then, with the case going cold, somebody looked properly at what was still on his wrist. It was a Rolex Oyster Perpetual, steel, not showy, the kind of watch that just sits there and works. Think about what a killer strips off a body. Wallet, cards, letters, labels, things with words on them. A watch has no words. It looks like an object, not a document, so it stayed on. But every Rolex carries a number, stamped into the case where you'd only see it with the bracelet off. And Rolex, unlike almost anyone, keeps the ledger. Every service, every repair, logged against that number and a customer. That's the mechanism. It isn't magic. It's a company that writes things down and never throws the book away. So a detective in Devon did something that sounds almost too simple. He rang Rolex and read out the number. The answer came back from the service records. That exact watch had been in for work years earlier. And the name written beside that serial number, in a ledger nobody had touched in years, was Ronald Joseph Platt. That's the first thing the killer got wrong. He treated a watch as jewelry. It was paperwork. But the watch wasn't finished. Because it stayed on the wrist, it had also been keeping time. An automatic Rolex winds itself from the movement of your arm. Walking, reaching, stirring a cup of tea. Stop moving, and it doesn't stop instantly. It coasts. Roughly a couple of days of stored spring, then silence. This one had a date window. When it wound down, the date froze on whatever day it had reached. So the dial was holding a number from the last day that man's arm ever moved. Count back the coasting time, and you get the week he died. Not a guess. A reading. One object, overlooked. It gave them his name and roughly the day he stopped being alive. If that just changed how you look at the ordinary things people carry, that's exactly what this channel does. Stick around. Now they had a name. They went looking for Ronald Platt. And this is where the case turns strange. Ronald Platt was real. Born in England in the mid-40s, raised partly in Canada, drifted back again. He fixed televisions. He had no money, no property, no family holding him in any particular place. He was, in the flattest sense, an easy man to lose track of. Which is exactly why he'd been chosen. The records showed a Ronald Platt very much alive, with an address, a bank account, a driving license. Recent activity. Bills paid. A man moving through the world leaving perfectly normal traces behind him. Which is awkward, when you're standing over his body in a mortuary in Devon. Two explanations. Either the watch record was wrong, or somebody was walking around wearing this man's life. So officers drove out to the address. A farmhouse. Comfortable. Nothing about it setting off any alarms. A man answered the door. Polite, well-spoken, helpful. Said yes, of course he was Ronald Platt. He had the paperwork to prove it. Birth certificate. License. Everything lining up the way it's supposed to. He explained he'd known the dead man vaguely. A friend who'd fallen on hard times. Sad business, really. And here's what undid him. His story about when he'd last seen that friend didn't survive a second visit. That's the thing about a story you've built alone. It's smooth until someone with a file asks the second question. Because the police weren't only asking who the dead man was anymore. They were asking who this man was. There was a wife at the house, much younger, 2 small children, a settled family on the face of it. The accent was Canadian. The papers were English. And the papers belonged to a man on a slab. Fingerprints don't care what your documents say. They took his, and they sent them to Canada. Canada wrote back fast, because they'd been looking for this man for nearly 6 years. His real name was Albert Walker. And in Ontario, he wasn't a mystery. He was a manhunt. So rewind. Because the man who answered that farmhouse door had a story starting 4,000 miles away. Walker had been a financial advisor in a small Ontario town. Church-going, trusted. The man you handed your savings to. Retirees, neighbors, people who'd known him for years. He took millions of their money and moved it offshore. In late 1990, days before it all came apart, he flew to England. He didn't go alone. He took his 15-year-old daughter with him and left his wife and his other children behind. In England he became a man called David Davis. His daughter was introduced to everyone as his wife. They lived that way for years. Same house, same surname, and eventually, 2 children of their own. But a made-up name is thin. No history, no school record, nothing behind it if anybody leans on it. Walker needed something better. A real identity, with a real paper trail, attached to a man nobody would miss. Then in 1991, through a bit of business in England, Albert Walker met a quiet, unlucky man called Ronald Platt. Platt was broke and easy company. Walker gave him work, gave him time, gave him what con men actually sell, attention. And Platt talked, the way people do, about the one place he'd ever been happy. Canada. So Walker made him an offer that must have sounded like the best luck of his entire life. He'd pay for the flight. Set him up over there, send him back to the country he wouldn't stop talking about. In 1993, Platt flew to Canada. Grateful. And he left his documents behind because Walker had offered to look after them. That's it. That's the whole trick. No violence, no forgery. A generous friend holding your birth certificate. From that day, Albert Walker stopped being David Davis and started being Ronald Joseph Platt. He used the name for years. Bank accounts, a company, a boat, school forms, the whole ordinary weight of a life. Meanwhile, the real Platt was in Canada, and it wasn't working. The work didn't hold. The money ran out. In 1995, he came back to England. Broke, and looking up the one friend who'd ever helped him. Picture Walker opening that door. The man whose name is on his bank statements is standing on the step. He didn't panic, and he didn't throw him out. He did something worse than either. He was kind. He found Platt a flat, paid the rent, kept him close, comfortable and quiet for about a year. Anyone who's put off a hard conversation for months, being extra nice in the meantime, knows the shape of that year. Then, in July 1996, he invited Platt down to Devon for a pleasant day out on his boat. The boat was called the Lady Jane. They went out into Lyme Bay, well past sight of anything. Only one of them came back. Platt went over the side with a diving belt round his waist. Walker went home to his daughter and their children, and carried on being Ronald Platt. A week or so later, a fishing net came up heavy, 6 miles off Teignmouth. And when police finally searched that boat, it gave up something Walker had forgotten about entirely. The GPS had stored a position, not a harbor, not a fishing mark, a patch of open water. It sat almost exactly where the trawler had hauled up the body. He'd saved the spot without thinking. There was a receipt, too, for 2 anchors. Only one anchor was ever found aboard that boat. In 1998, at Exeter Crown Court, Albert Walker was convicted of murder and sentenced to life. He'd taken the man's wallet, his labels, his face and his name, and still lost to a serial number. That's the useful part, and it's bigger than one case. Identity doesn't only live in documents. It lives in objects, serial numbers, service records, the ledger, some company kept about a thing you own. Your possessions have been quietly writing your biography in filing systems you never asked to join. A killer emptied a man's pockets and cut out his labels, and left on the one thing keeping records. Cases like this deserve remembering. Subscribe so the next one isn't forgotten. Next time, a murder solved by 1 grain of pollen. Ronald Platt was 30 years dead this summer, and we still say his name. Thanks for watching.